There are stories that begin with a scream. This one begins with silence. A silence so thick and salt-heavy that the fishermen of Dunhaven said later they'd felt it before they'd heard anything. A wrongness in the air, like the sea itself had paused to hold its breath. And somewhere in that silence, at the foot of a lighthouse that should have been dark for 30 years, a man lay dead on the rocks below. This is that story. If you've ever read Agatha Christie on a rainy afternoon with a cup of tea gone slightly cold, you'll know exactly the kind of company you're in. If you haven't, consider this your very best introduction. Death at the Crumbling Lighthouse is a 9-part mystery written in the classic Christie tradition. Fog, secrets, a village full of people with something to hide, eyes on one quietly brilliant old woman who sees everything. If this kind of storytelling is your sort of thing, do leave a like and subscribe so part 2 finds you before someone else spoils the ending. Every part drops one at a time, the way a good mystery should unfold. Slowly, deliberately, and with at least one detail you'll wish you'd caught earlier. Now then, shall we begin? Part 1. The Light That Should Not Have Been. The village of Dunhaven had always had a complicated relationship with the sea. It didn't fear it, exactly. People who fear the sea don't build their homes 20 feet from its edge, don't send their sons out in wooden boats before dawn, don't hang their washing on lines where the salt spray stiffens the sheets before noon. Oh no. The people of Dunhaven respected the sea the way you respect a difficult relative, with careful attention, quiet wariness, and the unspoken understanding that it could, at any moment, do something unforgivable. The morning of October the 14th began the way most Dunhaven mornings did, grey, damp, and smelling faintly of fish and wood smoke. Mrs. Polly Trent, who kept the post office and considered it her civic duty to be awake before everyone else, was pulling open her front shutters at 6:30 when she saw young Daniel Foss running up the coastal path. Not walking, running. And Daniel Foss, who was 43 years old and hadn't moved faster than a deliberate trudge since his rugby days, was the color of old candle wax. "There's a body," he said when he reached her gate. He put both hands on the post and breathed. "I was down at Whitmore, on the rocks." Polly Trent said nothing for a full 4 seconds. Then she turned back inside and picked up the telephone. By 8 o'clock, the coastal path to Whitmore Lighthouse was crowded with the quiet, purposeful activity of people who deal with death professionally, and the rather less quiet activity of people who simply couldn't help themselves. Inspector Gerald Narracott of the Dunhaven Constabulary, a solid, sensible man who had handled 2 drownings, 1 poisoning, and a remarkably complicated case involving a stolen fishing boat, stood at the base of the lighthouse rocks and looked down at what remained of Colonel Hugh Ashford, late of the British Army, late of Ashford Hall, and, as of some time last night, late of this world entirely. The colonel was 61. He had been, by most accounts, a difficult man, proud in the way that men who have had money for generations sometimes are, as though the money had calcified somewhere in the spine. He lay face down among the rocks, one arm extended as though he'd been reaching for something in his final moment, and the tide had come and gone around him at least once. His coat, good wool, well cut, was soaked through. "Fell from the upper ledge, most likely," said Dr. Emery, crouching beside the body with the careful economy of movement that came from 30 years of being called to unpleasant places. "The ledge railing on the south side is half rotted through. Man his age, in the dark, possibly with drink taken." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Narracott looked up at the lighthouse. The Whitmore had been decommissioned in 1954, officially retired when the newer automated beacon at Port Hallow Head took over its duties. Since then it had simply stood, the way abandoned things stand, slowly surrendering to weather and time, its white paint gone to grey, its iron railing giving way to rust, its door sealed with a padlock that looked more ceremonial than functional. Nobody owned it outright. The county had some claim to it. So, arguably, did the Ashford estate. Hugh Ashford's father had funded its construction, a fact Hugh had never allowed anyone to forget. There was no reason for Hugh Ashford to have been here last night, and there was certainly no reason for the lighthouse lantern to have been lit. It was Narracott himself who noticed it first. Or rather, it was the absence of it that he noticed. And he'd spoken to 3 witnesses already who'd mentioned, almost as an aside, that they'd seen a light from Whitmore the previous evening. Not the great sweeping beam of an active lighthouse. Something smaller, steadier, like a lantern behind glass, lit and then extinguished. "What time?" he'd asked each of them. The answers varied slightly. Sometime between 9 and past, for only a few minutes. He looked at the padlock on the lighthouse door. It was intact, closed, locked, apparently undisturbed, and yet he was still standing there, turning the problem over in his mind like a stone he wasn't sure he wanted to look under, when he became aware that someone had appeared at his elbow. She was a small woman, elderly, with white hair pinned neatly beneath a sensible hat, and she was wearing the expression of someone who had come for a pleasant seaside visit and found something considerably more interesting instead. She carried a knitting bag over one arm. She was looking at the lighthouse with pale, sharp, extraordinarily attentive eyes. "You'll forgive me," she said, in a voice that was gentle and precise and carried rather further than one expected. "I couldn't help but overhear. About the light." Narracott turned to look at her fully. "And you are?" "My name is Jane Marple. I'm staying with my niece, Ruth Prescott, on Harbour Lane. We arrived only yesterday. Rather dreadful timing, I'm afraid. Though one can never entirely predict these things." She paused. "The lantern was lit for 4 minutes, you said? Or thereabouts?" "I didn't say." "No," she agreed pleasantly. "But Mrs. Foss did just now, owing to the constable by the path. I wasn't eavesdropping. Or rather I was, but I find one so often has to in circumstances like these." She tilted her head very slightly toward the lighthouse. 4 minutes is a very particular amount of time. Not long enough to be careless. Long enough to be seen. Narracott looked at her with the expression of a man who had not yet decided whether to be annoyed or impressed. In his experience, elderly ladies who turned up at crime scenes were either hysterical or dangerous. This one appeared to be neither, which he found, if he were honest, slightly more unsettling than either option. "It's most likely an accident, Miss Marple." "Yes, I heard that too." She smiled, the way one smiles at a child who has said something one doesn't wish to correct just yet. "Of course, they're most likely." She looked once more at the lighthouse, at the sealed door, at the rusted railing far above where the grey October sky pressed down against the stone. "Tell me, Inspector," she said quietly. "Did the Colonel drink?" "By all accounts, not particularly." "No," said Miss Marple. "I didn't think so." She adjusted the knitting bag on her arm and turned back toward the path with the unhurried certainty of someone who has already seen, in the space of 10 minutes, considerably more than everyone else has managed in 2 hours. Behind her, the lighthouse stood silent and salt-bleached against the morning sky. And somewhere inside its sealed and rusted walls, whatever secret it had kept since last night waited, patient as stone, cold as the tide, for someone clever enough to ask the right question. To part 2, the widow with steady eyes. Ruth Prescott had always been the sort of person who dealt with distressing news by making tea. Not because she believed tea solved anything. She was a practical woman, 51 years old, with a solicitor's pragmatic view of human nature and a gardener's patient acceptance of things one cannot change. But there was something in the ritual of it. The filling of the kettle and the warming of the pot, and the careful measuring of leaves that gave the hands something honest to do while the mind worked through whatever unpleasantness had arrived. This morning, she had already made 3 pots. "You really ought to sit down, Aunt Jane," she said, setting a fresh cup on the table beside Miss Marple's chair. "You've been on that path since 7:30, and the wind off the sea is not—" "I'm perfectly warm, dear, thank you." Miss Marple accepted the cup with both hands and settled back with the contentment of someone who has had a productive morning and knows it. "Tell me about the Ashfords." Ruth sat down across from her. Outside the cottage window, Harbour Lane was beginning to show signs of life. A woman hurrying past with her coat collar turned up. Two fishermen standing by the wall speaking in the low, careful tones of people discussing something serious. Word travelled fast in Dunhaven. It always did. Hugh Ashford, Ruth said slowly, was not a well-liked man, which isn't the same as saying he deserved what happened to him. "Of course not," said Miss Marple. "Though it is worth noting, and unlike men tend to have specific reasons for being so. Go on." Ruth wrapped both hands around her own cup. He'd lived at Ashford Hall his entire life. The family had money once. Real money. The kind that comes with land and history, and a certain confidence about the future. Most of it's gone now. Death duties, poor investments, Hugh's own rather extravagant habits in his younger years. What's left is the hall itself, which is large, expensive to maintain, and entailed in the most complicated way imaginable. And Whitmore Lighthouse, or rather the land it sits on, which Hugh always insisted was Ashford property, regardless of what the county records might say. And who benefits from his death? Ruth hesitated. It was a brief hesitation, the kind that comes not from reluctance to answer, but from wanting to answer precisely. His wife, Eleanor, and his nephew, a young man called Peter Ashford, Hugh's brother's son. Hugh and Eleanor had no children. She paused. There's also the matter of the will, which is, I'm told, contested, has been for some time. Miss Marple looked up from her tea. Contested by whom? Peter. He believes Hugh altered the original will, their grandfather's will, which divided the estate equally between both brothers' lines, in a way that wasn't entirely legal. He's been pursuing it through a solicitor in Truro for the better part of 2 years. Ruth met her aunt's gaze. A solicitor named Marcus Hale, who also happens to be a personal friend of Eleanor Ashford. Miss Marple said nothing for a moment. She turned her teacup very slightly in its saucer, a small habitual movement that Ruth had learned over many years and meant her aunt was arranging something in her mind. "How friendly," Miss Marple said at last, "is personal." Ruth looked out the window. "That," she said carefully, "is what people here have been wondering for about 18 months. Eleanor Ashford received visitors in the front sitting room of Ashford Hall, which managed to be both grand and deeply set in the way that rooms do when they've been furnished for a life that didn't quite materialize. The curtains were good silk, but faded. The fireplace was marble, but the fire in it was meager. The flowers on the mantelpiece, white chrysanthemums, which Miss Marple privately considered the most melancholy of flowers, were fresh, which meant someone had thought to bring them this morning, which meant someone had known to bring them, as which was itself a small and interesting thing to file away. Eleanor was 54. She had been handsome once and was still striking. Dark-haired, though the dark now had silver running through it, with the kind of straight-backed posture that spoke of a careful upbringing and, Miss Marple thought, a lifetime of not permitting herself to appear diminished in front of anyone. She was wearing black, which might have been grief and might have been instinct. Her hands, folded in her lap, were trembling slightly, but her eyes, grey, clear, and watchful, were not. "I appreciate you coming," Eleanor said. She was speaking to Ruth, who had accompanied Miss Marple with the dual purpose of moral support and introduction. "Though I confess I'm not entirely sure what there is to say. The inspector tells me it was an accident." She said the word cleanly, without inflection. "It may well have been," said Miss Marple gently. Eleanor turned her gaze to Miss Marple with the polite, assessing attention of someone who has been introduced to a great many people and learn to read them quickly. Ruth tells me you're visiting from St. Mary Mead. That's right. I had no intention of... Well, these things happen as they happen, don't they? Miss Marple smiled. I hope you'll forgive a rather impertinent question, Mrs. Ashford. Did your husband have any reason to visit the lighthouse last night? A pause. Not long. Not quite long enough to be called significant, and yet... No, said Eleanor. None that I know of. He didn't mention going out. Hugh rarely mentioned where he was going. She said it without bitterness. Or rather, not with the kind of bitterness that has been so thoroughly lived with that it no longer registers as bitterness at all. It had simply become fact. He went out after dinner, around 8 o'clock. He said he wanted air. And you weren't concerned when he didn't return? Something moved behind Eleanor's steady grey eyes. Something that was not quite guilt and not quite grief, and was perhaps something more complicated than either. Hugh sometimes stayed out very late. He walked the coastal paths at night. He'd done it for years. She paused. I fell asleep. I didn't know until morning. Miss Marple nodded with the sympathetic understanding of a woman who has heard, in her long life, a great many things that people say carefully instead of the things they mean. She looked once at Eleanor's trembling hands, once at the fresh white chrysanthemums. Those are lovely flowers, she said pleasantly. Did someone send them this morning? Marcus brought them. Eleanor answered before she had quite decided to, and Miss Marple saw the small flash of awareness of having answered too quickly cross her face and disappear. Marcus Hale. He's a friend of the family. He heard the news early and came to see if there was anything. How very kind, said Miss Marple. They walked back along Harbour Lane in a thin, cold drizzle, Ruth with her umbrella up and Miss Marple with her hat brim turned down and her expression that of someone doing quiet arithmetic. Well, said Ruth after a while. She's frightened, said Miss Marple. But not of grief. People frightened of grief look inward. She's looking outward, watching to see what's coming. She stepped carefully around a puddle. And she answered the question about Marcus Hale before I'd finished asking it. That could mean nothing. It could, Miss Marple agreed. Most things could mean nothing. That's what makes it so important to notice the things that mean something. Ruth was quiet for a moment. Above them, a gull crossed the grey sky and disappeared. From somewhere down by the harbour came the sound of a boat engine starting, coughing, and then steadying. The reliable, patient sound of ordinary life continuing around the edges of catastrophe. Aunt Jane, Ruth said, do you think it was murder? Miss Marple considered this with the seriousness it deserved. I think, she said at last, and that a man who didn't drink fell from a lighthouse he had no reason to visit, while a lantern that hadn't been lit in 30 years burned for exactly 4 minutes. And I think his wife's hands shake, but her eyes don't. She paused. Whether that constitutes murder rather depends, I suppose, on what we find when we ask the right people the right questions. She looked back, just once, toward the grey headland where Whitmore Lighthouse stood against the October sky. And we haven't, she added quietly, asked the lighthouse keeper's daughter anything at all yet. The drizzle thickened. The sea moved, and somewhere in Dunhaven, someone who had been very careful was beginning, in the smallest and most imperceptible of ways, to grow afraid. Part 3. The Charming Man and the Keeper's Daughter. There is a particular kind of charm that announces itself. It walks into a room slightly ahead of the person carrying it, rearranges the furniture of everyone's attention without asking permission, and settles itself down with the comfortable assurance of something that has always worked before and expects to go on working indefinitely. Miss Marple had encountered this variety of charm perhaps a dozen times in her life. In vicars, in salesmen, in at least 2 murderers, and she had learned, through long and careful observation, that it was almost always a performance. And performances, however polished, had a tell. You simply had to watch long enough to find it. Marcus Hale's tell, she decided within 4 minutes of meeting him, was that he never quite stopped performing even when he thought no one was watching. He had come to the Harbour Inn ostensibly to meet a client, a perfectly ordinary reason to be in Dunhaven on a perfectly ordinary Wednesday, except that his client had cancelled the previous afternoon, a fact Miss Marple had learned from Polly Trent at the post office that morning with the ease of someone who had long ago discovered that post office proprietors know everything worth knowing in any village, coastal or otherwise. Ruth had arranged the introduction with the smoothness of a woman accustomed to navigating delicate social terrain. Marcus Hale was, she explained to Miss Marple beforehand, 39 years old, a partner in a Truro firm with an excellent reputation and personal ambitions that somewhat exceeded it. He was unmarried. He was, by the account of essentially everyone in Dunhaven who had encountered him, extraordinarily good company. He was also, Miss Marple reflected, watching him rise from his chair at their approach, almost too precisely what a charming young solicitor should look like. Dark suit, well fitted. A face arranged in exactly the right expression of subdued concern, present enough to acknowledge the morning's tragedy, restrained enough to suggest good breeding. He shook Ruth's hand and then Miss Marple's, with a warmth that was calibrated to the millimetre. Miss Marple. He said her name as though he'd been looking forward to using it. Ruth has told me a great deal about you. Has she? Miss Marple sat down and arranged her knitting bag in her lap with the unhurried movements of someone settling in for a long conversation. I hope not too great a deal. I find people are generally more interesting when one approaches them without too many prior opinions. He smiled. It was a good smile, genuine enough in its muscles, if not entirely in its intention. A fair point. Can I offer you something? Tea, perhaps? Thank you, no. I've had rather a lot of tea this morning already. She looked at him with the mild, pleasant attention that people so often mistook for vagueness. You must be very distressed about Colonel Ashford. I understand you knew the family well. Something happened in his eyes. It was very brief. A kind of internal adjustment, like a man shifting his weight before a difficult step. And then it was gone, and the smile was back, and he was saying, "It's a terrible business. Hugh was, well, he was a complicated man. But Eleanor is a dear friend, and I'm concerned for her." "Of course," Miss Marple nodded. "You were with her this morning, I believe. You brought flowers. I heard the news early. It seemed the right thing to do." Very thoughtful. She paused just long enough. "You must have heard very early indeed. Daniel Foss only raised the alarm at 6:30. The smile didn't waver, but the fingers of his right hand, resting on the table, moved. A small, involuntary curl, there and gone in a second. "I'm an early riser," he said, "and news travels in small places." "It does," Miss Marple agreed warmly. "It really does. That's one of the things I find so reassuring about villages. One is never quite alone with anything for very long." She said it kindly, in the tone of a woman offering a pleasantry. But she watched him receive it. And she saw, just for a moment, behind the performance and the good suit and the calibrated smile, something that was not quite ease. Nora Vane lived in a stone cottage at the far end of the village where Dunhaven stopped being a village and started being simply coastline, raw and windswept and indifferent to human arrangements. The cottage had a low door and small windows and a garden that had long since given itself over to salt grass and sea lavender, and it sat at the edge of the path that led, if you followed it far enough north, to the base of Whitmore Lighthouse. She was perhaps 35, though the coast had a way of aging people that made precision difficult. She had her father's colouring, that particular dark red hair that Miss Marple associated with Cornish families who had been on the same coastline for so many generations that the sea had got into the bloodline. And her father's eyes, which were the grey-green of deep water and held, Miss Marple thought, a similar quality of depth. Thomas Vane had been Whitmore's last keeper. He had stayed on for 3 years after the lighthouse was decommissioned, living in the cottage attached to the base of the tower with the stubbornness of a man who could not quite accept that his life's purpose had been retired by committee. He had died in 1961, which made Nora perhaps 4 or 5 years old at the time, and she had grown up on stories of the light the way other children grew up on fairy tales. She received Miss Marple without surprise, which was itself a small surprise. "I wondered when someone would come," she said, standing aside to let her in. "I saw you on the path this morning. You were looking at the lighthouse differently than the others." "How were the others looking at it?" "Like a place where something bad happened." Nora moved to the small stove and lifted a kettle without asking. "You were looking at it like it had something to say." Miss Marple sat down at the kitchen table and looked around the room with quiet attention. There were photographs on the mantelpiece. An older man in keeper's uniform, stern and weathered, who could only be Thomas Vane. Maps of the coastline. A pair of binoculars on the windowsill, positioned with a particular intentionality of something used regularly rather than stored occasionally. You watch the lighthouse," Miss Marple said. Nora set 2 cups on the table. "I've watched it every night for 20 years, she said without embarrassment. "It's what's left of him. My father." "I know that sounds—" "It sounds entirely understandable," said Miss Marple gently. Nora sat down. For a moment she looked at her own hands. Capable hands, weathered at the knuckles, steady in a way that Eleanor Ashford's were not. Then she looked up. "I saw the light last night." Miss Marple said nothing. She had learned over a long life that silence was often the most productive question. "It was lit at 9:17, Nora said. "I know because I looked at the clock when I saw it. I always look at the clock, old habit from when my father kept the log." She paused. "It burned for 4 minutes and then it went out. So in 20 minutes after that, I saw someone on the coastal path. Moving away from the lighthouse, heading back toward the village. Walking fast." "Could you see who it was?" "No. It was dark and foggy, and they were wearing a dark coat, but—" She stopped. "But?" Miss Marple asked quietly. Nora wrapped both hands around her cup. Outside the window, the sea moved and the wind pressed against the glass, and the world seemed to reduce itself for a moment to just this small warm kitchen and the weight of what was about to be said. "They weren't walking like someone who'd just had an accident," Nora said. "They weren't running. They weren't panicked. No, they were walking the way you walk, when you've done what you came to do and you want to be somewhere else before anyone notices." The silence that followed had a particular quality. The quality of a thing finally spoken aloud that has been pressing against the inside of someone's chest for hours. "Miss Vane," said Miss Marple carefully, "did you tell Inspector Narracott this?" Nora looked at her. "I tried. This morning. He was very polite. He wrote something down." She paused. "And then he told me that people see all sorts of things in sea fog and that the Colonel's death was most likely an accident and that I shouldn't trouble myself." Miss Marple considered this for a moment. "No," she said at last, in the tone of someone filing a piece of information in exactly the right place. "Well, he'll come around, I expect." She picked up her teacup. "Tell me about the lighthouse itself. The door, the padlock. Could someone get in?" "The padlock's been replaced," Nora said. "About a month ago. I noticed because the old one had a particular kind of rust pattern I'd looked at for years, and one morning it was simply gone, and there was a new one." Her grey-green eyes were steady and certain. "I don't know who replaced it. But someone did, and someone had a key." Miss Marple set down her cup very carefully. Outside, the wind shifted, the seagrass bent, and somewhere up the coastal path, Whitmore Lighthouse stood in the October grey with its new padlock and its old secrets and its 4 minutes of inexplicable light, waiting, as it had always waited, with the infinite patience of stone. 3 people, Miss Marple reflected. walking back along the path toward Harbour Lane with the wind at her back and her mind moving with quiet, certain purpose. A wife whose hands shook but whose eyes watched. A solicitor whose smile never quite reached the place where honesty lives. And a keeper's daughter who had seen something in the fog that everyone else was very keen to explain away. 3 people, and a lighthouse with a new lock, and a dead man who didn't drink. It was, she thought, beginning to take shape. Part 4. What the lighthouse? Kept the key was Narracotte's idea, which surprised Miss Marple slightly, and his willingness to use it surprised her considerably more. He appeared at Ruth's cottage at 8:30 the following morning with the expression of a man who has spent a sleepless night losing an argument with himself. He got a key on a plain metal ring that he set on the kitchen table without preamble. County Council had a spare, he said, accepting tea from Ruth with the automatic gratitude of the chronically tired. Apparently the lock was replaced 6 weeks ago on the order of someone in the estate's office. Nobody thought to mention it to anyone locally. He looked at Miss Marple. I spoke again with Nora Vane last evening. Did you? Said Miss Marple pleasantly. She's consistent. He said it as though consistency were a quality he'd stopped taking for granted. Same details, same times, same description of the figure on the path. He turned the key over once on the table. I'd like you to come with me to the lighthouse this morning. You notice things. It was not, Miss Marple reflected, the most effusive invitation she had ever received. But it was sincere, which counted for considerably more. Whitmore Lighthouse in the morning fog was a different creature than it was from a distance. Up close, the scale of its neglect became specific and personal. Paint peeling in long strips like sunburned skin, iron fittings orange with rust, the stone of the base darkened by 40 years of uninterrupted weather. And yet it stood with the absolute structural confidence of something built to outlast the people who built it, which Miss Marple found, under the circumstances, faintly unsettling. The new padlock opened cleanly. The door, despite its appearance, swung inward with only a brief resistance. Its hinges, Miss Marple noticed, had been recently oiled. Another small, deliberate thing. Someone had wanted this door to open quietly. Inside, as the lighthouse smelled of stone and salt and something else. Something recent and human. Lamp oil. The ground floor was a single circular room, empty except for the remains of the keeper's furniture. A table missing one leg, propped against the wall, a rusted iron bracket that had once held a clock. The spiral staircase ran up through the center of the structure, its iron steps solid despite the rust, and Narracotte went first with a torch, while Miss Marple followed at her own pace, one hand on the railing, her attention moving carefully over everything the torchlight touched. On the 3rd landing, she stopped. Inspector. He came back down 2 steps. She was looking at the wall beside the landing window, a small rectangular space where the stone was marginally cleaner than the surrounding surface. There was a square of relative cleanliness in years of accumulated grime. Something had hung there, recently, and been removed. A bag, perhaps, Miss Marple said, or a box. Something hung on a hook. There's a hole in the mortar, do you see? Recent. The dust hasn't settled back into it yet. Narracotte looked at it in silence for a moment. Then he took out his notebook. They continued upward. The lamp room at the top was small and glass enclosed, the great lens still present but dulled with grime. And it was here that the smell of lamp oil was strongest. The lamp itself, the original Fresnel lens assembly, had not been operational in decades. But beside it, on the narrow metal service shelf, sat a separate object entirely. A ship's lantern, old but functional, its reservoir recently filled, its wick recently trimmed and recently extinguished. When someone had carried it up here, lit it, let it burn for 4 minutes, and left it behind, which was either careless or deliberate, and Miss Marple had a firm opinion about which. A signal, said Narracotte. Yes, said Miss Marple. The question is whether it was a signal to someone on the water or whether it was a signal to someone on the path. Someone who was meant to see it and come. She looked at the lantern without touching it. Or someone who was meant to see it and know it was time. Peter Ashford was waiting for them at the base of the lighthouse when they came out, which told Miss Marple two things immediately: that he had been watching the path, and that he had decided, after what had probably been a difficult internal debate, to stop watching from a distance. He was 28, and lean in the way of people who move through the world with unresolved tension, with his uncle's jaw and none of his uncle's settled authority. His coat was damp at the shoulders. He had been standing in the fog for some time. "I need to speak with someone," he said to Narracott. Then his eyes went to Miss Marple with the uncertain assessment of someone who hadn't prepared for her specifically. "Both of you, I suppose." They stood on the coastal path with the sea moving below them and the lighthouse at their backs, and Peter Ashford told them that 3 weeks ago he had found, among papers his solicitor had uncovered during the inheritance dispute, a letter, written by his uncle, to Eleanor, dated 14 months ago. He didn't have it with him. His solicitor, not Marcus Hale, he said this with pointed emphasis, had the original. But he had read it. He remembered it. In it, Hugh Ashford told his wife that he knew about Marcus Hale, that he knew what they intended, that he had made arrangements accordingly, and that whatever they were planning would not in the end go the way they imagined. "He knew," Peter said. The wind took the words slightly. "He knew, and he didn't go to the police. He wrote a letter, as though that would be enough." His voice had something raw in it that wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite anger, but lived in the difficult territory between them. It wasn't enough. Miss Marple looked at him for a long moment. "No," she said quietly, "but it may be now." The fog was lifting. Slowly, the way fog always lifts. Reluctantly, in pieces, revealing the coastline beneath as though uncertain how much to show. Miss Marple stood at the top of the path and looked back at Whitmore Lighthouse one last time before turning toward the village. A signal, a letter, a new lock and oiled hinges and a lantern left behind. Someone had been very careful. But careful, in Miss Marple's long experience, was not the same as invisible. And the careful ones always left something. She just had to find it before they realized she was looking. Part 5. The Shape of Old Money. There is a particular kind of silence that old houses keep, not the silence of emptiness. That is simply absence and has no character of its own. This is something older and more deliberate, the silence of rooms that have absorbed decades of careful conversation, of things said quietly so the servants wouldn't hear, and of agreements reached across dinner tables that were never written down because writing them down would have made them real in the wrong kind of way. Ashford Hall had this silence in abundance. Miss Marple noticed it the moment Ruth's friend on the County Historical Committee, a brisk, tremendously useful woman named Barbara Hext, let them in through the side door with the confidence of someone who had catalogued every room and felt proprietary about all of them. Hugh Ashford had been dead for 41 hours. The hall felt it. Barbara Hext had been researching the Ashford family for 3 years as part of a broader project on coastal estate histories, and she had the researcher's particular gift of retaining everything and contextualizing nothing, which meant she could tell you exactly what had happened without necessarily understanding why it mattered. Miss Marple found this tremendously useful. "The original will," Barbara said, leading them through a corridor lined with portraits of Ashfords going back to the 1700s, each one wearing the same expression of prosperous, mild displeasure, was Cornelius Ashford's, Hugh's grandfather, signed in 1932, witnessed by 2 solicitors and a vicar. Left the entirety of the estate, hall, grounds, lighthouse land, investments, to be divided equally between his 2 sons upon the death of the surviving parent. "Hugh's father and his brother," said Miss Marple. "Edmund and Robert, yes. Edmund was Hugh's father. Robert was Peter's grandfather. Now, Robert died in 1959 before their mother, which complicated matters considerably. His share should have passed to his son, then to Peter's father, then to Peter. Standard inheritance, nothing exotic. She paused at a door and opened it into what had clearly been a study. Bookshelves, floor to ceiling, a large desk, and the specific atmosphere of a room where a powerful person has recently and permanently stopped being powerful. But Hugh's father, Edmund, had the will re-examined in 1963 and produced what he claimed was a codicil, a later amendment, that redirected Robert's share entirely to the main Ashford line in the event of Robert's branch dying out in the male line. Which it hadn't, said Ruth. Which it hadn't, no. Peter exists. Peter's father existed until 2019. The codicil, if genuine, was irrelevant on its own terms. But Hugh used it anyway, used it as the basis for a separate arrangement that effectively consolidated the entire estate under his sole control, cutting Peter's branch out entirely. Barbara stopped at the desk and looked at it with the expression of someone who has formed opinions about the person who used to sit behind it. Peter's solicitor has been arguing for 2 years that the codicil was forged. Hugh's solicitor, Marcus Hale, has been arguing that it wasn't. Miss Marple stood in the center of the study and looked around with the quiet, comprehensive attention she gave to rooms that had things to tell her. The bookshelves were orderly, the desk was clear, but the filing cabinet in the corner, a solid old-fashioned thing, 3 drawers, had its bottom drawer very slightly open. Not much, perhaps half an inch. The kind of not quite closed that happens when someone has been through it in a hurry and pushed it shut without checking. She crossed to it and looked at the bottom drawer without touching it. "Has anyone been in this room since the Colonel's death?" she asked. Barbara frowned. "Eleanor, presumably, and Marcus Hale came yesterday afternoon. Eleanor asked him to handle the initial administrative matters." "How very helpful of him," said Miss Marple. The document that mattered, or rather the absence of it, became clear when Barbara, with the authoritative ease of someone who had catalogued the filing system herself 18 months ago, went through the bottom drawer folder by folder. The codicil copy was gone, not the entire file. The file was there, the original index card clipped to its cover, faithfully noting its contents. But the document itself, the copy of the 1963 codicil that Hugh Ashford had relied on for 20 years as the legal foundation of his consolidated claim to the estate, had been removed. "Marcus," said Ruth. "Almost certainly," said Miss Marple. Though almost certainly is not the same as provably, which is rather his speciality, I suspect. She straightened up. "The question isn't whether he took it. The question is why. If the codicil supported his position, removing it helps no one, which means—" "It didn't support his position," Ruth said slowly. "Or rather, it supported Peter's. The codicil was forged, and Marcus knew it, and at some point he obtained proof of that, and instead of using it for Peter, he used it for himself." She stopped, as leverage. Miss Marple looked at her niece with the quiet approval of a teacher whose student has arrived, by their own reasoning, at exactly the right place. "Hugh's letter to Eleanor," Miss Marple said. "He wrote that he knew what they were planning and had made arrangements accordingly. I think Hugh discovered that Marcus had the proof of forgery and was using it. Not to help Peter, not to expose Hugh, but to extract something from Eleanor in exchange for his silence." She moved toward the window and looked out at the grey October grounds. Marcus wasn't Eleanor's ally against Hugh. He was managing both of them, keeping Hugh afraid and Eleanor dependent. "Until Hugh decided he'd had enough," said Ruth quietly. "Until Hugh decided he'd had enough," Miss Marple agreed, "and wrote a letter instead of doing something sensible, which was very much a man of his particular generation." She paused. "And then someone made certain he never did anything sensible again." There was a gardener raking leaves on the far lawn, the sound of it carrying thinly through the old glass. Somewhere in the hall behind them, a clock ticked. Barbara Hext stood by the filing cabinet with the expression of a woman reassessing everything she had considered merely historical. "There's one more thing," Barbara said. She hesitated, which was uncharacteristic enough that both Miss Marple and Ruth turned to look at her. "When I was researching the estate records last year, the Lighthouse land specifically, I found a discrepancy. The land Whitmore sits on isn't in the codicil at all. It was transferred separately in 1961 into a private trust." She paused. "The trust has two beneficiaries, the Ashford estate and a private individual." Miss Marple was very still. "What individual?" she asked. Barbara looked at her. "A woman named Vane," she said. "Catherine Vane, Thomas Vane's wife, the lighthouse keeper's wife." The clock ticked, the gardener raked, and Miss Marple stood at the window of a dead man's study and felt the shape of the thing shift, quietly, completely, into something older and stranger and considerably more human than she had expected. Nora Vane, she thought, whose father kept the lighthouse, whose mother held a share of the land it stood on, who watched it every night for 20 years and said it was all that was left of him, not just memory, not just grief. Inheritance. Part 6. The Trap Laid with Kindness. Miss Marple had set traps before, though not the theatrical kind, not the dramatic reconstruction or the assembled suspects in a drawing room, though she had participated in those too, and they had their place. The traps she preferred were quieter. They were built from the same materials as ordinary conversation. A question asked, slightly too casually, a piece of information offered that was not quite complete, a silence left open just long enough for the right person to feel compelled to fill it. They required patience and a thorough understanding of human vanity, which Miss Marple had found, over a long life, to be essentially inexhaustible as a resource. The trap she had in mind for today required one additional ingredient: the truth. Nora Vane opened her cottage door before Miss Marple had finished knocking, which meant she had seen her coming up the path, and which meant she had been watching. This was useful information in itself. "I wondered," Nora said simply, and stood aside. The kitchen was the same, the maps, the photographs, the binoculars on the sill. But the binoculars had been moved since yesterday, Miss Marple noticed. Repositioned very slightly, angled not toward the lighthouse headland, but toward the coastal path that ran between Dunhaven and Ashford Hall. Someone had been watching a different direction this morning. Miss Marple sat down and folded her hands on the table and looked at Nora Vane with the particular quality of attention she reserved for moments when kindness and directness needed to occupy the same sentence. "Your mother," she said, "held a share in the Whitmore Lighthouse land." Nora sat down. Something in her face shifted. Not surprise, as Miss Marple noted carefully, but the particular expression of someone who has been waiting for a specific door to open and is now watching it open and is not entirely sure whether to feel relieved or afraid. "Yes," she said. "Did you know? I found out 4 years ago, going through my mother's papers after she died." Nora looked at her hands. "There was a deed, a trust document, my father's name and my mother's name and the Ashford estate, equal shares in the land the lighthouse stands on." She paused. "My father never told her what it meant. She didn't understand it. She just kept it with the other papers because it had his signature on it, and she kept everything with his signature. But you understood it. I took it to a solicitor in Penzance, not Marcus Hale. I didn't know him then, but even if I had—" She stopped. "He told me the trust was legally valid, that if I could establish my mother's claim, I had a right to half the value of that land." She looked up. "The lighthouse land is worth considerably more than it appears. There's planning potential, coastal development. Hugh Ashford had been quietly pursuing permissions for 2 years. Miss Marple received this without visible reaction. "And Hugh knew about your mother's share?" I went to him 18 months ago, directly because I thought, I don't know what I thought, that he would be reasonable, that he might not have known. The corner of her mouth moved in something that was not quite a smile. He knew, he'd known for years. He told me the trust document was invalid, that my mother had misunderstood its nature, that I had no claim, and if I pursued one, he would make certain it cost me considerably more than it was worth. She paused. He was very calm about it, very certain, the way men are when they've had money long enough to believe the law bends toward them naturally. And then you went to Marcus Hale. Nora was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the sea moved with its usual indifference to human complication. He came to me, she said, about a year ago. He said he'd heard about my situation. I don't know how, village, I suppose, and that he might be able to help, that he had access to certain documents relating to the Ashford estate that could support my claim alongside Peter Ashford's. She looked at Miss Marple steadily. He was charming, and he seemed genuinely interested in helping. He wanted something in return. He wanted access to the lighthouse. She said it quietly, as though she was still not entirely certain what it meant. He said there were documents hidden inside, historical records relating to the trust that Hugh had concealed there years ago. He needed to retrieve them without Hugh knowing. He asked if I still had my father's key. Miss Marple was very still. Your father's key to the lighthouse? Keepers kept copies. My father had one. I've had it since he died. She looked at the table. I gave it to Marcus 6 weeks ago. He said he'd return it after he'd retrieved what he needed. He had the padlock replaced. Said the old one was too fragile and he couldn't risk Hugh discovering anyone had been inside. She paused. He gave me back a key, and I assumed it was my father's key. I didn't think to check whether it was the same one. Miss Marple thought about the new padlock, the oiled hinges, the ship's lantern on the service shelf. Did you know he was going to the lighthouse the night Hugh died? No. The word was immediate and certain. I knew he'd been inside at least once. I saw a light there about 3 weeks ago, briefly. I assumed that was him retrieving what he needed. When I saw the light on the night of the 14th, I thought... She stopped. I didn't know what to think. And the figure on the path afterward? Nora met her eyes. I've been asking myself for 2 days whether it was Marcus. The height was right, the way they moved. She exhaled slowly. I can't be certain. Yeah, I won't say I'm certain when I'm not. Miss Marple nodded once with the quiet respect of someone who values precision over convenience. That's honest, she said. And honesty is going to matter very much in the next 24 hours. She looked at Nora directly. I need you to do something that may feel uncomfortable. I need you to contact Marcus Hale today and tell him that you've found something in your mother's papers. Another document. Something that references the Lighthouse Trust and names a third party you didn't know about. Tell him you don't understand it and you'd like him to come and look at it this evening. Nora looked at her steadily. There is no such document. No, Miss Marple agreed. But he doesn't know that. That and a man who has gone to very great lengths to control what exists and what doesn't. She paused. Will not be able to resist coming to make certain. The silence between them had the quality of a decision being made. What will you do? Nora asked. When he comes. I'll be here, said Miss Marple simply. With Inspector Narracott, who will be in the back room and will hear everything. She folded her hands. The trap, you see, isn't the document. The trap is that a guilty person, given the opportunity to remove the last loose thread, will always take it. They cannot help themselves. It's the one vanity that never fails. Nora looked at her for a long moment. At this small, white-haired, as entirely unremarkable-looking woman sitting at her kitchen table speaking about guilt and vanity with the calm authority of someone who has looked at human nature for 8 decades and arrived at a settled peace with what she found there. All right, Nora said quietly. Miss Marple rose and gathered her knitting bag and moved toward the door. Then she paused, as though remembering something minor. "One more thing," she said. "Lock your door tonight until Narracott is in position, and don't let Marcus Hale in until I'm already inside." She said it gently, in the tone of someone reminding a friend to bring an umbrella. "Just a precaution." She walked back along the coastal path with the wind behind her and the lighthouse to her left and the village ahead, and she allowed herself, just briefly, and the quiet satisfaction of a thing arranged correctly. Not pleasure. It was never pleasure. Not when a man was dead and 2 or 3 lives were about to change permanently. But satisfaction, yes, the satisfaction of a pattern made visible, of a truth that had been moving through the fog, patient and inevitable, finally arriving at the shore. Tonight, she thought, the lighthouse would give up its last secret, and someone who had been very careful for a very long time was going to discover that careful had not been careful enough. Part 7. The careful man makes one mistake. Narracott arrived at Nora Vane's cottage at 7:30 with a younger constable named Briggs, who had the useful quality of being entirely forgettable in appearance. So when the 3 of them arranged themselves with the quiet efficiency of people who have committed to a plan and understand that confidence in its execution is half its success. Briggs went into the back bedroom with instructions to remain still and silent regardless of what he heard, which Miss Marple suspected he would manage admirably. Narracott positioned himself in the narrow pantry off the kitchen, door pulled to but not latched, with a clear sight line to the table through the gap. Miss Marple sat in the chair she had occupied that morning, her knitting bag open, her needles in her hands, looking precisely like what she was. A small elderly woman engaged in entirely ordinary domestic activity, which was, she had always found, the most effective disguise available to her. Nora sat across from her and held a cup of tea she wasn't drinking and watched the window. "He'll come," Miss Marple said quietly, not looking up from her knitting. "How can you be certain?" "Because I've known men like Marcus Hale my entire life," she said, with the serenity of someone stating a geographical fact. In St. Mary Mead they are generally on a smaller scale. A dishonest solicitor's clerk, a man who quietly empties his elderly mother's savings account. But the essential character is identical. They believe themselves to be the cleverest person in any room they enter, and that belief is precisely what makes them manageable. Nora looked at her. "Has it always worked? Your method?" Miss Marple considered this with genuine honesty. "Not always," she said. "Once, in a matter involving a poisoned marmalade, and I was nearly entirely wrong about the husband. But the principle holds. People are consistent. That is both the tragedy and the convenience of human nature." He knocked at 8:14. Not hesitantly. That was the first thing Miss Marple noted. A confident knock 3 times. The knock of a man who has decided something on the walk over and arrived having already convinced himself it was reasonable. She heard Nora cross to the door, heard the latch, heard Marcus Hale's voice saying good evening with the particular warmth of someone managing multiple registers simultaneously. And then she heard a second voice. Lower. Female. Careful. Eleanor Ashford stepped into the kitchen behind Marcus Hale and stopped when she saw Miss Marple. And for one very complete second, the room held 3 entirely different reactions at once. Marcus's face going through something swift and controlled that resolved itself back into pleasantness almost before it had begun. Eleanor's grey eyes moving from Miss Marple to Nora, to the room with a rapid assessment of someone recalculating, and Nora, to her considerable credit, showing nothing at all. Miss Marple looked up from her knitting. "Mrs. Ashford," she said warmly. "What a surprise. Do sit down." It was Marcus who recovered first, which confirmed something Miss Marple had suspected about the architecture of their arrangement. He was the one who managed surfaces, and Eleanor, beneath her composed exterior, needed a moment longer when the surface changed unexpectedly. "I hope you don't mind Eleanor joining us," he said, settling into a chair with the ease of a man redistributing weight onto more comfortable ground. "She's been anxious about Well, about all of it. The estate matters, the investigation. I thought it might help her to hear directly from Nora about this document. Of course, said Miss Marple. The more the merrier in matters of documents. Something shifted in his eyes at the word documents. A fractional sharpening, there and gone. You've found something in your mother's papers, he said to Nora. You mentioned a third party named in the trust? Yes, said Nora. She had, Miss Marple noted with approval, the steady voice of someone who has decided to be brave and is finding it more accessible than expected. A name I didn't recognize. Edmund Ashford made a private notation in the margin, handwritten, separate from the main document, and it references an agreement made with my father about the lighthouse land. A side agreement, something outside the formal trust. Marcus was leaning forward very slightly. The performance of casual interest was excellent. The interest itself was not quite casual enough. Do you have it here? I'll get it, Nora said, and rose and went into the back room. The silence she left behind lasted perhaps 4 seconds. In those 4 seconds, Miss Marple watched Marcus Hale and Eleanor Ashford with the undivided attention of someone who knows that unscripted moments are when the truth surfaces. Eleanor spoke first. She turned to Marcus and said, very quietly, "She shouldn't have that." And Marcus said, with a precision that suggested it was not the first time he had said something similar, "I know." It was enough. Not everything. Not a confession, not a full accounting, but enough for Narracott, who pushed open the pantry door and stepped into the kitchen with the quiet authority of a man who has been waiting for a specific sentence and has just heard it. Briggs appeared in the back doorway a moment later, and the geometry of the room rearranged itself permanently. Marcus Hale looked at Narracott, then at Miss Marple. The performance didn't collapse. She gave him credit for that. It simply became visible for what it was. A performance. A very good one that had run until tonight without a critic in the audience. "Inspector," he said pleasantly, "I wonder if I might—" "I'd prefer you didn't," said Narracott. He wasn't unkind about it. "Mr. Hale, I'd like you to come with me. Mrs. Ashford. The Constable Briggs will stay with you while I arrange for someone else to come." Eleanor Ashford did not protest. She did not perform. She sat in the chair beside the kitchen table and folded her trembling hands in her lap and looked at them. Just looked at them as though seeing them clearly for the first time, and said nothing at all. It was the most honest thing Miss Marple had seen her do. After they had gone, Marcus with Narracott, Briggs and a second constable who had been waiting outside with Eleanor. Nora stood in the middle of her kitchen and let out a breath that seemed to come from somewhere deep and long held. "There was no document," she said. "Not a question." "There was no document," Miss Marple confirmed, and she had put her knitting away and was gathering her bag with the unhurried movements of someone completing a task that has gone as expected. But there didn't need to be. What mattered was that he came, that he brought Eleanor, which I had not anticipated, but which was, in the end, more useful than anything a document could have provided. She paused at the door. She said he shouldn't have it. That tells us she knew about the lighthouse land. That tells us she understood what was at stake. And Marcus's response tells us he'd been managing it all along, Nora said quietly. "Yes." Miss Marple looked at her. "You were very composed. Your father would have been proud, I think." Nora looked at the window, at the dark coastline beyond, at the faint silhouette of Whitmore against the night sky. Her expression was complicated in the way that expressions are when grief and resolution arrive at the same moment and have to share the same face. "Will it be enough?" she asked. "For the police?" "It's a beginning," said Miss Marple honestly. "There is still the matter of the night itself, of what precisely happened on that ledge, and that will require more than one evening's conversation to establish fully. But a beginning is not nothing. She opened the cottage door. A beginning, in my experience, is usually where the truth has been waiting all along. She walked home along the coastal path in the dark, the sea to her left and the village lights ahead and the lighthouse at her back. And then she thought about Eleanor Ashford's hands, the ones that shook, and the thing that had been troubling her since that first morning in the sitting room at the hall. Not the shaking, the stillness of everything else. The eyes that watched, and the voice that measured, and the flowers that arrived too early. Marcus Hale had planned the mechanics of it, she was almost certain. But Eleanor had wanted something, had needed something. And need, in Miss Marple's long experience, was always the deeper root. Tomorrow, she thought. Tomorrow that root. Part 8. The root of it. Eleanor Ashford looked smaller in the morning, not physically. She was still the same straight-backed, silver-dark-haired woman who had received Miss Marple in the hall's faded sitting room 3 days ago, but something had gone out of her overnight, as the watchfulness, perhaps, the constant outward vigilance that Miss Marple had noticed from the first, the eyes that monitored doors and measured silences and calculated the distance between what was being said and what was being understood. That had gone. What remained was simply a woman of 54 sitting at a table in a room that smelled of old stone and cold tea, with her hands folded in front of her and nothing left to manage. Narracott had agreed to Miss Marple's request with less resistance than she'd expected. 20 minutes, he'd said. I'll be outside the door. If she asks you to leave, you leave. He had paused. She hasn't asked for her solicitor yet, which is either innocent or very calculated, and I genuinely cannot tell which. I know, Miss Marple had said. That's why I'd like to speak with her. She sat down across from Eleanor and did not begin with a question. She began, instead, with the truth, or rather, with one precise piece of it, offered not as an accusation but as a gift, the gift of being known. You didn't go to the lighthouse that night, Miss Marple said. Eleanor looked at her. Something moved behind her eyes, that old watchfulness stirring out of habit, then settling again. No, she said, I didn't. But you knew someone was going. The silence that followed was not a denial. It was the silence of a woman deciding after a very long time of deciding otherwise, to stop. Marcus told me he was going to speak with Hugh, Eleanor said at last. Her voice was even, careful, still, but with a different quality of care, the care of someone choosing accuracy rather than concealment. He said Hugh had agreed to meet him at the lighthouse, that they were going to settle the matter of the codicil privately, between them, without lawyers or courts or any more of the grinding of it. 2 years of letters and counter-letters, and Hugh's face at dinner every night looking at me as though I had personally constructed the legal system to inconvenience him. She stopped. I was tired. I was so extraordinarily tired of all of it. What did you think Marcus intended? An agreement. She said it simply. Hugh would acknowledge the codicil was questionable. Peter would receive his share, Marcus would receive his fee, and the whole thing would be finished. She looked at her folded hands. That is what I thought. Aye, that is what I told myself. Miss Marple looked at her steadily. And the other thing you told yourself? Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. The cold morning light came through the single window and lay across the table between them without warmth. Hugh knew about Marcus and me, she said. Not guessed, knew. He had known for 8 months, and he had said nothing and done nothing except look at me across dinner tables and write a letter he apparently never sent, which was so entirely Hugh. To know something and hold it and use the knowing as a kind of permanent leverage without ever spending it. She exhaled slowly. Marcus told me that Hugh had threatened him, that Hugh intended to expose Marcus's handling of the inheritance matter to the Law Society, that Marcus would be disbarred, and that everything would come apart. She paused. He said he needed to speak with Hugh alone and settle it. And you believed him. I believed that I wanted it to be settled. She looked up, and her grey eyes were entirely clear, not the watchful clarity of 3 days ago, but something raw and more honest underneath it. There is a difference. I know there is a difference. I have known there was a difference since 6 o'clock on the morning of the 15th when Daniel Foss found Hugh on the rocks. Her voice didn't break. It simply became quieter. I chose not to examine the difference too closely, because if I examined it, I would have to know what I had allowed, and I was not ready to know that. Miss Marple said nothing. She let the silence do what silences do when they are given enough room, expand, and fill with the things that have been waiting to be said. He went up to the lamp room, Eleanor said. Marcus, he told me afterward. Not everything, not directly, but in the way he spoke about it. Hugh was already there when he arrived. They argued about the codicil, about me, about the land. Hugh told him he had left a letter, with Peter's solicitor, to be opened if anything happened to him. A pause. Marcus said Hugh became agitated, that he moved toward the broken railing, that it was an accident. Do you believe that? The question sat between them, plain and unornamented. Eleanor looked at it for a long time. I believe, she said carefully, that Marcus went to that lighthouse, knowing the railing was broken. I believe he chose that location. I believe Hugh's agitation was arranged. She stopped. I cannot prove any of that, and I don't know that I could have stopped it, but I knew enough beforehand that I should have. Her voice finally, quietly, did something human, not breaking, simply acknowledging weight. I should have known what I was allowing. Miss Marple looked at this woman. This careful, exhausted, compromised woman who had wanted the grinding to stop and had not asked herself precisely how it would be stopped, and felt the thing she always felt at this point in these matters. Not satisfaction, not judgment, something more complicated and less comfortable. The recognition of how ordinary it all was, how entirely, terribly ordinary. Not a monster, not a villain from a story. Simply a person who had been tired and frightened and had chosen, at the crucial moment, not to look. You'll need to tell Narracott everything you've told me, Miss Marple said gently. All of it, including what Marcus said afterward. I know. Eleanor unfolded her hands and laid them flat on the table, those hands that had trembled for 3 days, finally still, in the way that things go still when the effort of holding them in tension is no longer necessary. I think I've known since the morning they found him. I've just been finishing being a coward. Miss Marple rose. She gathered her knitting bag and moved toward the door and then paused, as she sometimes did, because there was one more thing that needed saying, and she was perhaps the only person who would say it without cruelty. Eleanor, she said quietly, Hugh was not a kind man, and Marcus Hale used that. Used your exhaustion and your loneliness and the very reasonable misery of your situation. With considerable deliberation. That is true, and it matters, and it will matter to how this is understood. She paused. But it is also true that a man is dead on the rocks at the bottom of a lighthouse, and those two things have to exist together. They can't cancel each other out. Eleanor Ashford looked at her with eyes that were tired and clear and entirely without defense. No, she said softly. They can't. Miss Marple opened the door and found Narracott in the corridor with the patient expression of a man who has heard through a closed door, enough to understand that the next several hours of his professional life are going to be considerably more complicated than he'd hoped. And who has made his peace with that. Well, he said. She'll tell you everything, Miss Marple said. Be kind about it. She's been carrying it for 3 days and it's heavier than it looks. Narracott looked at her for a moment with the expression he sometimes wore in her presence. The expression of a man who had entered a situation expecting to be the most perceptive person in it and had revised that assessment early and completely. Thank you, he said. Simply, without qualification. Miss Marple nodded and walked down the corridor toward the morning light coming through the station door, and behind her she heard Narracott knock gently twice and push the door open and begin, in a quiet and decent voice, to do his job. Part 9. The Light Remains. Ruth Prescott had a habit, when something was finished, of making one final pot of tea. And not the functional tea of difficult mornings or the consoling tea of bad news. This was different. This was the tea of completion, of a thing having run its full course and arrived, however painfully, at its proper end. She made it with the good leaves she kept for occasions, and she set out 2 cups on the kitchen table, and she sat across from her aunt in the pale October sunshine that had finally, after 4 days of fog and grey, decided to appear. Tentatively, apologetically, like a guest who knows they've arrived late but hopes they're still welcome. Miss Marple wrapped both hands around her cup and looked out the window at the harbour where the fishing boats sat in the morning calm, and the sea, for once, was quiet. "Marcus will be charged with murder," Ruth said. It wasn't a question. She'd spoken that morning with Narracott, who had the careful manner of a man delivering conclusions he'd arrived at reluctantly and was now entirely certain of. Eleanor's account, combined with Peter's letter, Hugh's letter, and the evidence from the lighthouse itself, the oiled hinges, the lantern, the removed document, the replaced padlock. She paused. "Narracott says it's sufficient." "It is," said Miss Marple. "He chose the location deliberately. He knew the railing. He arranged the meeting in a place where an accident would be entirely plausible." She turned her cup very slightly in its saucer. The lantern was the one thing he didn't account for properly. He lit it as a signal to Eleanor, to let her know the meeting was happening, that things were in motion. He thought it was private. A small, intimate communication between 2 people who believed themselves unwatched. She paused. He didn't know about Nora. He didn't know someone had been watching that lighthouse every night for 20 years. No. Miss Marple's expression held something quiet and considered. He made the mistake that careful people most commonly make. He accounted for everyone he knew about and forgot that the world contains people he didn't know about. You cannot plan around the existence of a lighthouse keeper's daughter who loved her father. Ruth was quiet for a moment, turning her own cup in her hands. Outside, a gull landed on the harbour wall and regarded the morning with the ancient indifference of its kind. "And Eleanor?" Ruth asked. Miss Marple considered this with the seriousness it deserved. She knew enough. She will have to account for that, and she knows it, and I think the accounting will be honest. She's not, at her core, a dishonest woman. She's a woman who made a series of choices that led her somewhere she didn't intend to go, and who told herself, at each step, that she wasn't quite responsible for the next one. She paused. "The law will decide what that amounts to. It isn't nothing, but it isn't what Marcus is." "There's a difference," Ruth said quietly, "between the person who does the thing and the person who didn't stop it." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "and the law recognizes that difference. Imperfectly sometimes. But it tries." She went to see Nora Vane that afternoon. The cottage was the same. The maps, the photographs, the sea light coming through the small windows at an angle that made everything look slightly more significant than it was. But Nora herself was different in a way that Miss Marple recognized and valued. The difference of someone who has done a frightening thing and discovered, on the other side of it, that they are still standing. "Peter Ashford telephoned this morning," Nora said, setting tea on the table with the automatic hospitality of a woman who has grown up in a place where the kettle is always on. "His solicitor, the one in Penzance, not—" She paused briefly. "Not Marcus. He says that with the codicil effectively discredited and Hugh gone, the estate will revert to the original terms of Cornelius Ashford's will. Peter will receive his share." "Good," said Miss Marple simply. "He also said—" Nora sat down and looked at her cup for a moment. "He said that he'd looked into my mother's trust claim, that his solicitor thinks it's valid, and that the lighthouse land, properly assessed, would—" She stopped, then started again. "I wouldn't have to leave the cottage. I've been afraid since Hugh died and the estate became uncertain that whoever inherited might—" She stopped again. "You can stay," Miss Marple said. Nora looked up. "I can stay." The simplicity of it, 3 words, the weight they carried, sat between them for a moment with the particular significance of things that matter more than they sound. Miss Marple looked at the binoculars on the windowsill, at Thomas Vane's photograph on the mantelpiece, the stern, weathered keeper in his uniform, standing at the base of his lighthouse with the particular pride of a man who knows his purpose. "Your father would have been glad," she said. "Not just about the land, about all of it. That you watched, that you saw, no, that you said what you saw even when no one wanted to hear it." Nora looked at the photograph for a long moment. Something in her face was very quiet. Not sad, exactly. The particular quality of a grief that has been lived with long enough to become not smaller, but more familiar, more integrated into the shape of a life. "He used to say," Nora said softly, "that the light's job wasn't to see everything. It was to make sure that whatever was out there in the dark couldn't pretend it wasn't." Miss Marple received this in silence. Then she nodded, once, with the expression of someone who has just heard a thing said better than they could have said it themselves. She walked to the lighthouse one final time before leaving Dunhaven. Ruth had offered to come. Miss Marple had said no, thank you, kindly. Some things were better done alone, and this was one of them. She walked the coastal path in the thin, late afternoon sunshine with her knitting bag over her arm and the sea to her left, running blue-grey and restless all the way to the horizon, and she stopped at the base of Whitmore and looked up at it with the unhurried attention of someone who is not trying to solve anything. It was, she thought, a rather magnificent thing. Battered and salt-grey and comprehensively retired from its original purpose, but magnificent in the way that objects built to last tend to be magnificent. Not despite their damage, but somehow including it, the way a human face is more interesting at 70 than at 20, precisely because of what it has absorbed. A man had died here. That was true, and it was terrible, and it would not stop being either. The Marcus Hale had stood on the lamp-room ledge and used a broken railing and a fog-covered night and 40 years of a difficult man's difficult life, and he had ended it with the cold efficiency of someone who had decided that another person's existence was primarily an obstacle to his own. That too was true. That too would not stop being what it was. But also, a lighthouse keeper's daughter had watched from her window and seen a light that lasted 4 minutes and had told the truth about it even when no one wanted to hear it. A nephew had kept a letter and brought it forward at the moment it mattered. A woman had sat at a table in a police station and finally, exhaustedly, stopped performing and simply told the truth. These things were also true. They existed alongside the terrible thing, inseparable from it, part of the same story. The Miss Marple stood at the base of Whitmore Lighthouse and thought that this was, in the end, what she had learned from a lifetime of looking at the worst that people did to each other. Not that people were bad, not that people were good, but that they were both, always, at the same time, capable of the calculation that sent a man over a railing and capable of the faithfulness that watched a lighthouse for 20 years out of love for a dead father. The same species, sometimes the same person. You couldn't look at one without the other. You could only try to make sure that the light, whatever remained of it, kept burning. She turned back toward the village. Ruth drove her to the station the following morning in the small practical car that suited her entirely. And they said goodbye on the platform in the way of people who are genuinely fond of each other and have no need to perform it. "You'll come back," Ruth said. It was not quite a question. "One never knows," said Miss Marple, which was her standard answer to that particular variety of question and meant As Ruth had long since learned, yes, probably, when something interesting happens. The train came in with the reliable punctuality of rural branch lines that have been running the same route for 80 years and have no particular reason to change. Miss Marple settled into her seat and arranged her knitting bag and looked out the window as Dunhaven slid past. The harbour, the fishermen, the white cottages pressed together against the coast wind and, just visible on the headland before the line curved inland, and the grey shape of Whitmore Lighthouse standing against the October sky. Still standing, as it had stood for 100 years, as it would stand, she suspected, for 100 more. She watched it until the curve took it from view. Then she opened her knitting bag and took out her needles and her wool and began, with the comfortable certainty of someone returning to a thing they know and trust, to knit. Outside the window, England moved past in its autumn colors, brown and gold, and the particular deep green of fields that have been fields for a very long time. Miss Marple knitted and thought about nothing in particular, which was itself a kind of luxury after several days of thinking about something very particular indeed. In Dunhaven, the sea continued its ancient indifferent work. The boats went out. The post office opened. And Nora Vane made her morning tea and looked out her window at the lighthouse on the headland, at the stone tower standing salt grey and patient in the coastal light, and felt, for the first time in 4 days, something that was not quite peace, but was perhaps the beginning of it. The lighthouse had no light to give any more, but it was still in all the ways that mattered, keeping watch. And sometimes, Miss Marple had always thought, that was enough. Thank you for reading. If this story found you on a grey afternoon with a cup of tea gone slightly cold, then it arrived exactly where it was meant to. Like, subscribe and come back for the next mystery. Miss Marple, as always, will be ready.